Hey class, we are going to start on chapter 11 this week, which is our Theories of Personality chapter. This chapter is going to cover different types of theories of personality, also how we do testing for personality as well. Alright, so our definition of personality is the unique and stable ways people think, feel, and behave. So personality is one of those things that is rare in psychology in that your personality remains pretty stable across time, and your personality is completely unique to you. It's more unique to you than your fingerprint or your DNA. No one has a personality that is exactly like yours because no one has lived the exact same life as you or had the exact same life circumstances as you. Even identical twins don't have an exact same personality. So while personality does have a pretty big genetic part to it, it's also how you've experienced the world that has built up your personality. So it's very unique to you, and it is very stable across time. Your core personality traits, what make you you, don't change very much as we grow. Do you change? Of course you do. Do your opinions change? Can your likes and dislikes change? Yes, but that isn't your personality. So as we go through and we kind of start looking at personality and traits within personality, and we'll get to the trait theory later on next week, you'll see that these things about you don't change greatly over time. All right? So because we know personality is pretty stable across time, it can help us kind of predict other things about you, which is what we use personality for a lot in psychology and in research. Alright, so there's four main perspectives that look at personality. We're going to spend a pretty hefty amount of time, and this week's just going to be devoted to psychodynamic theory, which is Freudian theory and who we call the Neo-Freudians. The behaviorists, of course, have to put in their 2 cents on personality. So, spoiler alert, they're going to say it's reinforcement and punishment. The humanists talk a little bit about personality and what our personality kind of goals are. And then finally we're going to talk about the trait theories, which is what we mostly use currently to study personality. So these two here I'm just going to kind of briefly go over because they don't have a whole lot that they talk about. We're going to talk a lot about psychodynamic, and we're going to talk a lot about trait theory. Alright, so there is a lot in this chapter. There's a lot of vocab in this chapter. This is a pretty hefty chapter. So just make sure that you're watching all of the videos, you're taking notes, you're reading the book, and you're just paying attention to what's going on. Alright, so we're going to study Freud first because he was the first psychologist to propose a theory of personality, of how personality is formed. So we're going to learn about Freud because historically he's important, and everything that came after built on him a little bit at least. And the Neo-Freudians, the people who came after Freud, have also done a lot with this. But as we'll see, I'm going to present you with all of the entire Freudian theory, but it's really wackadoodle. Like, Freud was super crazy. So this is when I remind you that A, Freud did a lot of cocaine. B, Freud didn't have anything to be working with, right? He didn't have anyone else's research to refer to. He was just coming up with this kind of, out of nowhere. Also, a good thing to remember, which is going to be really important when we get into this chapter, when we get into this theory, is that Freud never actually studied a single child. So his entire theory is about children, but he never studied kids. He studied adults who were talking about their childhood. So this is problematic in multiple ways. It's not super scientific, number one. Number two, as we learned in the last chapter, our memories suck. So our memories of what occurred during childhood are not a great way to say this is what childhood is like, right? If we want to know what childhood is like, we should study children. And Freud never did that. So just kind of keep all of that in the back of your mind as we go through Freud and his super crazy theory. So yes, it's a super crazy theory. I understand that. You're going to be saying, what? A lot of the time, as will I. However, after I present the whole theory and say, okay, here it is in its crazy, beautiful mess, there is about 3% of Freudian theory that actually does hold true over time. And I'll kind of point out what that is as we move through. All right, so a little background on Sigmund Freud. We talked about him a little bit in chapter 1, but I'm going to give you a little bit more here. He is the founder of the psychoanalytic movement. And remember, anything with the prefix psycho, or not anything, but most things with the prefix psycho are going to come back to Freudian theory. Psychoanalytic, psychodynamic, psychosexual, psychosocial, all of those go to a Freudian type theory. So it's important when we're looking at Freud's theory to think about where was he coming from, when was this happening? So Freud wrote his theory during the Victorian era. So this was the turn of the last century. So it was the late 1800s, early 1900s. All right, there was a lot going on at this time. There was a lot of sexual repression, especially for women. Sex was seen for procreation only for women. Women were actually viewed as being asexual. Men had a lot of mistresses. There were prostitutes everywhere and a whole lot of STDs. Men were seen as having uncontrollable sexual desire. So men just had to be doing it all the time, right? They can't help themselves. That penis was just, like a stick that just showed them the way. But women were asexual, right? They weren't supposed to like sex or want sex unless they were a prostitute, of course. So there was this big dichotomy, right? You had the prostitutes who were the nasty, gross women who did the prostitution stuff. And then you had the proper ladies who were supposedly asexual, didn't want sex, only didn't have babies, the end. And when you think about the way women dressed in the Victorian times, right? Very covered up, lace all the way up to their, tops of their necks, down to their feet, arms covered, right? If you showed your ankle, ankle slut, right? Can't do that. So as far as sexuality went, very, very odd time going on here. Now, what, was really happening, of course, was that women aren't asexual. Women enjoy sex. Women like having sex, Whoa, shocker, spoiler alert if any of you didn't realize that already. So the women were having a lot of, stress and trauma and, all kinds of problems with this because they weren't supposed to ever kind of express themselves in a sexual way. So a lot of them were having anxiety and issues. And the people of Victorian times were oh, it's probably something wrong with your insides. So if a woman was showing any signs of depression, anxiety, or any kind of mental disorder, they would usually try to solve it using medicine in some way, and a lot of times that involved taking things out. So they would just start removing organs from women. There were some doctors who believed that any mental illness in women was caused by the teeth, so they would just start ripping their teeth out until eventually they had no teeth left, and they were oh, you're cured. Yeah, just really horrible, horrible things. If you look at historically how women have been treated, since the beginning of time, just really awful, awful things being done. So eventually, doctors, and this is in medical textbooks, not anymore, but back in the day, said that, when a woman was being hysterical, which pretty much meant she maybe had anxiety, maybe had depression, or maybe she had views that, I don't know, women should be allowed to vote, things like that, being crazy, that it must be her uterus, right? Because obviously. And they believed that the uterus would come undone somehow, and it would float around the body all willy-nilly. And that was what was making women have these crazy thoughts and crazy behaviors. It was the uterus. Oh no, my uterus, it's in my foot again. I'm crazy. And yes, this is actually what doctors believed. And so to stop the crazy, to stop these women being hysterical all the time with their hysterics, they would remove their uterus. They would just go in and yank that thing right on out. And that is why to this day, the removal of the uterus is called a hysterectomy. I'm removing the hysteria from you. Isn't that fun, ladies, that we haven't even changed the name of that procedure and that's how it got its name? So lovely, so happy we still call it that. So all these women were having hysterectomies and all these things, and it was just, crazy. So Freud was you know what? Maybe, just maybe, when people are showing signs of some sort of mental trauma or mental issues. Maybe it's a mental thing and we can cure it or make it better by talking to them about it. And we don't have to just start taking stuff out of them. All right. And remember that Freud was an actual doctor. He was a neurologist. He went to medical school. Right? He was not a trained therapist because that wasn't a thing. Freud pretty much invented therapy, which he really didn't. He stole it, but we'll talk about that later. But he kind of came forward and was like, I don't think taking parts out of people is the way to cure people's, anxieties and depressions and things like that. Which, although I hate Freud for many, many things, which we'll talk about later, I have to give him props for that because he did say, maybe we should stop taking all the uteruses out. And so, fun fact for you all, as a little bonus for listening to my lectures, you get to learn fun little historical facts that you can bring up one day, or shock your parents that you learn about these things in school. So, all these women back in the day, right, were, having, sexual repression and all these things, and, not knowing what was on with them, and they were depressed, and they were just feeling like, ugh, and, my husband, doesn't do anything with me. And he goes to, prostitutes all the time. So there was this one doctor, and women would come into him and say, hey, I'm not, I'm just feeling down or whatever. And so he was like, oh, it might be your uterus. Let's check you out. So he would get them up on the table and start, poking around down there. And he decided that, maybe if I poke around at some of the outer parts, it'll make, help them out. So he was, pushing, pulling, rotating, jiggling around down there in the nether regions. And hey, surprise, surprise, sometimes the women would have an orgasm. And so the woman would have an orgasm and she'd be like, woohoo, oh my God, I feel so much better. Wow, damn, I feel so much better, doctor. Thank you. I think you've cured me. And he was like, huh, all right. So then she would go and tell her friends, hey, this doctor helped me. And so another woman would come in and the doctor would do the same thing to them and they would have an orgasm and they'd say they feel better. And pretty soon all of the women all around town were coming to this doctor and saying, hey, I need your, classic treatment, really, which was just him, finger banging them to give them an orgasm. And so what happened was that so many women were coming to see him, 15, 20, 30, 50 women a day to see this man, that his hand started cramping up from, working with them so much that he's like, there must be something I can do. And so he's like, what if there was some sort of device that I could use that could vibrate and, do this for me so I don't have to be using my hand all the time. And he put a device together, and that doctor invented the vibrator. And the vibrator was invented 10 years before the toaster. So now fun fact, vibrator invented 10 years before the toaster because a doctor's hand got too cramped from giving women orgasms as a way to stop them from having anxiety and depression. Yay! See how many fun things? Don't you miss being in class and learning these fun things with me? I miss telling you these fun things in class. All right. So, Freud talked a lot about how our mind was structured and how this contributed to personality. So, if you think about your mind as a iceberg, right? And you have this part is the part that you're conscious, you're thinking about right now, you're interacting with the outside world. And everything down here is everything else that's on your mind, right? That you're not really thinking about, but that's there. It's in there somewhere. So you can think of your mind as, just your brain, your soul, whatever, but here's all the other stuff that's down there. So you have this pre-conscious level here. So this is stuff that you're not consciously aware of right now, but you could bring up into here if you needed to. And then you have your unconscious, which is this huge part down here. And your unconscious is where Freud believed we shoved all the stuff we didn't want to deal with. All right, so it's not in our awareness level. We can't pull it up into consciousness easily because we've kind of just shoved it all down as far as it can go, because it's all this stuff that we kind of don't want to deal with or we think is kind of bad about us.